This was a thing since 2016. I thought Snow White was slated for a 2023 audience. Well, too bad somebody had to ostensibly delay the movie again. If only she kept her mouth shut. Snow White 2025 is a boring, unwatchable slogfest that was destined to fail from the outset, largely due to the already defiled reputation garnered by Disney's live-action remakes of beloved classics. That in addition to the controversy this movie has been enveloping itself in for years on end, starting even before trailers were coming out. For Disney, there didn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel with this project, and it got the score it deserved. Usually, critics defend or even love these remakes. So why is it that Snow White got hammered on by more than just the masses? Well, it's because the movie's execution is so scuffed and so cowardly that it fails to appeal to anyone on either side of the political spectrum in an industry which has turned to politics for seemingly every movie, which is why most high-profile Hollywood movies have become so bland and boring. Speaking of politically charged reels, let's talk a bit about the controversy surrounding Snow White 2025's lead, Rachel Zegler, an entitled spoiled brat who made herself into a meme whilst garnering endless vitriol from the masses and even other celebrities, especially those of the conservative crowd. She sowed disrespect over the original 1937 movie to such a vindictive degree that she later backpedaled in later interviews, pretending to celebrate the legacy of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So yes, chances are she got the message, but it was her own rhetoric that delayed an already overdue movie by a year or two, cementing Snow White 2025 as a victim of development hell. I feel like critics would have been fonder of Snow White 2025 had the movie stuck to its guns and had Zegler one-upping the Queen and doing basically everything whilst emasculating the dwarves, who in the original film lured the Queen to her doom. The movie still kinda does that by implementing a B-plot, which the dwarves take little to no part in, but the Queen is defeated in such a foolish way that it leaves you wondering why this blatant rewriting of an already functional story was even necessary. How can knowing someone's name convince them you're fighting for? Why would they rip off Wish, of all things? This is so nonsensical that even the critics, usually vying for sterilization of good content, deem this move a cop-out. Usually when Disney checks off a box, they tend to placate the critics' expectations, but for this particular flick, that same box was checked by a pen that lost all its ink. Speaking of Snow White doing all the work, notice that the title also leaves out the Seven Dwarfs, as it is just called Snow White, which implies that they're not important in any way enough to deserve acknowledgement. They're nowhere to be seen in the movie's B-plot about Snow White confronting the evil queen at her castle, as previously mentioned. As for the dwarves themselves, their personalities are neutered so they don't pop on screen alike in the original movie. While all of them have been heavily compromised, the most blatant example of this is Dopey, who has magically come to possess lingual capabilities, has become intelligent to the point of having almost no personality, and is only being gaslit into thinking he's unintelligent and dopey, which not only harms the other dwarves in their characterization and likability, or lack thereof in this case, but is such a huge nerf to the character and his classic 1900s cartoon charm. He's become so sterile to the point of character assassination. Dopey was rewritten to placate a modern audience. The sterilization of comedy and treating it like it's a bad thing is why Dopey was rewritten to be this bland, boring everyman with no personality. Doc, as another example, lost his stuttering and mixing up words because, remember, comedy and humor are considered bad in the modern age. You're not meant to laugh while watching a family film. You're meant to stare at the screen whilst feeling dead inside. At least was made with heart, passion, and levity in mind. That's why Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is such a good family movie. Even adults can appreciate its simple characters with memorable and fun quirks. The dwarves weren't the only ones crippled by the inevitable reworking of the script. Well, Zegler, I think the reason why that is because the unnamed prince was repurposed into another character entirely, in the form of a low-class brigand named Jonathan. And to imply that Snow White doesn't get her life preserved by a man is really something, because Jonathan not only kisses Snow White to revive her from the apple's spell, like in the original movie, assuming he's supposed to be the analog to the prince, but he also tanks an arrow shot. I don't remember the latter being in the original, but remember, sometimes less is more. Speaking of less is more, why did they cast a non-singer as the evil queen in a musical? The woman can't even act, so they could at the very least salvage our ears by having her not sing this pointless villain song. Now usually I don't mind race swaps that much since they don't usually affect the characters too much, such as the huntsman in this movie. For example, him being black doesn't really change anything about the character, but in the case of, well, Snow White herself, it is rather egregious. Say what you want about casting Halle Bailey as Ariel, but at least no part of Ariel's character came from her skin color. Snow White is a different case entirely. She was named as such by her parents because of her skin color. So casting a tan, over-entitled Latina to play Snow White doesn't really make sense in the slightest. Disney knew it, so they spent another couple $1 million to justify the race swap in this dumb snowy carriage scene. When put into a vacuum, the 2025 remake doesn't seem too different from the standard live-action remakes. In fact, I'd say Peter Pan and Wendy is a worse movie to watch, but at least it's not remaking the first ever animated movie to come to fruition. Yes, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs has a legacy, one that is so important the 2025 remake tacked on rewrites and reshoots just to show they at least pretended to respect it after Zegler exercised her power trip. That's why we have to ask, if Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from 1937 was the very first feature-length animated film in recorded history, then why make it in live action? Doesn't that literally defeat the purpose of that film? Especially when Walt Disney himself said not to mess with it? Disney not only reworked what wasn't broken, but they also went out of their way to spit at and strangle the very thing that made them so big to begin with. The original movie was beloved because it was an ambitious project that was executed flawlessly, especially for the time. It doesn't matter if the movie isn't anything special narratively or thematically. It doesn't matter if it had not aged perfectly. It's an incredibly important footnote in the history of film and animation, regardless of how you look at it. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is ancient, and its animation still looks gorgeous for today's standards. When I look at the supposed remake, the first thing that comes to my mind is, who asked for this? Why would Disney go out of its way to waste well over $300 million as well as almost an entire decade's worth of development time just to make something nobody wanted?